Cutscenes are a huge part of progressing the story to the player. Nearly all games have some sort of cutscene that moves the story along, giving the player information, quests, or just furthering lore. Some cutscenes remove all control from the player, forcing them to watch the scene. One way of achieving cutscenes is to use a pre-rendered video file, meaning no matter the quality of the platform, the cutscene will remain the same quality. However, you will lose all customization. Alternatively, you can use real-time cutscenes in games. This means you script the cutscene in the game, and it allows you to have real-time player customized characters in the cutscenes.
Give up the money! This a raid!
Ryder, not this.
Some cutscenes, mostly pre-rendered ones, are visually different to the main game. Whichever style you pick, cutscenes are incredibly useful. In this tutorial, I'll be using Unity 3D to show you how to implement a rendered in-game cutscene that you'll be able to activate by walking up to, watch it, and then leave, just like a section from We Happy Few. This style of cutscene isn't specific to We Happy Few, but it's the one I'm basing it off. Hi, I'm Decryption, and if you find any part of this tutorial useful, please hit that thumbs up to support me. For this tutorial, I'll be using Unity version 2020.2.3, but any Unity version featuring Cinemachine should be fine. I'll also have the universal render pipeline activated, but this tutorial isn't renderer specific, so you can use HDRP or any other renderer you wish. The other thing I'll be including by default is the standard Unity examples workstation scene. This is just to give me a base layout and is included in my version of Unity, but this tutorial can be followed with your existing environment or any others. The only packages required in this tutorial are Cinemachine to handle the cutscene's cameras, TextMeshPro to have much better text control, the Timeline in order to organise sections of the cutscene together, and LeanTween to control custom scripted animations. Once your project's been created, we can now go and import the prerequisite packages for this tutorial. So you can go up to Window and Package Manager, and then change the top packages drop down to the Unity registry. Once this is loaded, and it can take some time, we'll go and install the packages we need for this tutorial. We'll start with the Timeline system. As you can see, mine says Update, as Unity has already included this in the project. However, sometimes it will say Install, so just click it. Once the Timeline has been installed, we can then go and install the Cinemachine, and then TextMeshPro. In order to try and make the tutorial as short as it is, I'm going to be using a first person controller I found on the Asset Store by another user. You can simply get to this by going Window, Asset Store, and clicking the Search Online button. While you are there, you're going to need to go and download LeanTween as well, but this is optional later. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to drag out the first person controller. As you can see, the materials look like they're missing. They're not actually missing, it's because the materials were built using the Unity standard renderer and not URP or HDRP. You can easily convert this by going Edit, Rendering Pipeline, Universal Render Pipeline, and upgrade your project materials, or you can just drag another material on like I have here. Next, we're going to start fleshing your world out a little bit. I'm going to expand the floor so our character has more to move around on. Just make sure you delete the main camera, as our first person character already comes with a camera, and then you can play it. As you can see, we now have a bigger scene to move around on and we can look around the landscape. However, you can also see that we can walk through the walls, so let's just fix that now. This is easily resolved by simply adding a type of collider to the objects you want to prevent going through. In my case, I'm going to use a box collider. As you can see, one of the colliders is too big for the object, so I'm simply going to edit the collider and drag it down to the correct size. Perfect. Now that's done, I'm going to give the player a tag of player. Next, I'm just going to rotate and move the workbench into a nicer position because it's a bit in the way at the moment. Perfect. And now that's done, you can still see some UI on the actual object itself, such as lights, cameras and icons. You can simply remove this by tapping the gizmos button at the top. Next, I'm going to add a collider to our workbench just to make sure we can't go through it, and then if we playtest it again, you can see now we can't walk through anything on the scene. Perfect. In order to add some more features to our cutscene, I'm going to duplicate the construction light and place it just in a position where it can simulate a workbench light. And then I'm going to start deleting things out of it, such as the legs that I don't want. However, if you ever get a message that you cannot restructure a prefab instance, it means that your object is a part of a prefab, so you can't change it. So what you can do to get around this is by right clicking on the parent, prefab, and choosing unpack completely. So now that we've unpacked it, we can successfully delete the objects we don't want, such as the legs. I'm also going to grab the spotlight and move it next to the first light in order to simulate a table light and just rotate it looking at a table. Perfect. So part of the cutscene will be to activate and deactivate objects during the cutscene. So what I'm going to do is go into the workbench inside prefab mode, which is the little arrow next to the parent, and I'm going to create a game object within it called cutscene objects, and then I'm simply going to move everything in there that I want to enable or disable. Then once you leave prefab mode, you should be able to deactivate and activate the cutscene objects game object, and then see your items appear and disappear. Finally, I'm just going to get our cutscene ready for the state of starting. I'm going to deactivate the cutscene objects and the spotlight. Depending on the type of cutscene you want depends on our next move. If you want the player to retain full control during the cutscenes, you can skip this next step of creating the player controller script. However, if you want to freeze your player during the cutscene, which is what we're going to do today, go ahead and create a player controller script, as we need a way to deactivate all the player's components. If you open up the player controller, we're going to use something special called a singleton pattern. This is going to mean that we are going to make a static variable of our player controller, meaning it can only ever be created once, and then we're going to reference it within itself. The next part of the singleton pattern is to actually set the instance variable we've created. So in the awake method in Unity, which starts as soon as the game loads, I'm just going to reference the instance script to this, which is the current player controller script. Now, I'm going to create a method called activate, and this is going to take everything on our player controller and activate it and then deactivate it when we want to freeze or allow the player to move. As you can see from our player controller, we have many scripts we need to control, and on our camera we also have more scripts to control as well. The next step is for each script or component you want to change or control on the player, we're going to create a variable for it and set the scope to private. We're also going to set it to serialized field, as private variables don't render in the inspector, so you won't be able to assign them, whereas serialized fields will render in the inspector, but still keeping the private scope. The next step is for each variable you've just created to simply set the enabled to true in the activate method. You will also notice that I've added the player model as a game object variable, and this is simply so we can hide the player during the cutscene in order to not have any camera clipping. Once you've done that, you can duplicate the activate method and then call it deactivate and set everything to false instead of true, thus disabling the player. Now that you've done that, simply drag the player controller script onto the main player and then populate all the variables from the scripts and objects you want to control. The next step is starting and stopping the cutscene. Now normally you could just create a simple script to do this, to enable a single cutscene, however I want to make this more generic so it can fit into most places. So instead I'm going to create a folder in the scripts folder called abstract, and I'm going to create a new script called Interactable that will handle all our interactions. The first thing I'm going to do is, because this will be a generic script, is I'm going to set the type to be abstract class at the top. This will mean that nothing will be able to create an instance of Interactable without it inheriting from it, as you will see later. The first thing I want our Interactable script to handle is when our player is trying to interact with it. So because this Interactable script will have a collider on it, I'm going to add an onTriggerEnter method with a parameter of collider, and then I'm also going to check if the tag of the current object hitting it is player. The next step is to create an activate and deactivate function inside the Interactable script. This is different to the player controller's activate and deactivate, as this will simply activate or deactivate the Interactable object. Next, we also want to create an onTriggerExit and then copy the compare tag from the enter into the exit to determine when the player's left. Next, due to Unity's execution order on all the methods, the onTriggerEnter is not called as frequently as the update method. So in order to detect if the player is in range, we're going to create a simple boolean at the top called playWithinRange, and in the onTriggerEnter we're going to set it to true, and on the onTriggerExit we're going to set it to false. Next, we're going to create Unity's update method, which is called a lot more frequently than the onTriggerEnter, and we're going to add an if statement in saying if the player is within range and the user presses the key of E to activate the cutscene, we're simply going to call the activate method. Since we plan to use this script to inherit from, any method we caption in here with virtual means it can have its functionality overridden by any other class that inherits from our Interactable script. So if you jump back into Unity, right click in your hierarchy and choose UI, TextMeshPro Text, and it will pop up if this is your first time using TextMeshPro with an importer. Just click Import TMP Essentials, and then when it's done, import TMP Examples and Extras to give yourself a few fonts. Now that TextMeshPro is set up, you can rename the text object to Interact, and I'm just going to set the text input to press E to interact. And then you can change any colours or other outline settings you want while you're here. For a good idea what the UI will look like, you can use the game view. As you can see, our UI is not currently visible because it's off screen. So if you use the alignment tool at the top to centre it to the bottom, you will start to see it appear. And with a few adjustments to the rect transform, we can set the position Y to 100 and the width to 400 to successfully see the UI. I'm just going to give it an outline, and then as you can see, we will simply activate and deactivate it when we need to use it. Then we're going to add a canvas group to our interact element. The canvas group is used by LeanTween in order to fade it in and out smoothly. So just set the alpha to 0, untick interactable, block raycast, and ignore parent groups, and then deactivate the game object. Now if you jump back into your interactable script, we're going to create another variable which is going to be serialized field, and it's going to be a private canvas group, and we're going to call it Interactable UI. Once you've done that, it's time to actually show and hide the Interactable UI. So in your on-trigger enter, use the LeanTween library to change the alpha canvas, pass your Interactable UI as the first parameter, then the amount you want to set it to, which will be you want to set it to 1 so it's visible, and the time you want it to take, so I'm going to say 1 second. After you've done that, what you need to do is stop any other processes from touching this canvas group, otherwise you're going to get glitches if you walk in and out of the cutscene. So just do LeanTween.cancel, and then you need to just pass the game object to it. The final step is to enable the game object for the interactable UI. So just do interactable UI.gameObject.setActive and set it to true. Now that you've got your interactable object showing and hiding, just make sure in the activate method you disable it, otherwise it will just constantly stay there throughout your cutscene, which is not good. And the final part of the interactable UI, in your on-trigger exit, simply use LeanTween.alphaCanvas and set it back to 0, passing in the 3 parameters of your UI 0 and the time you want to take on 1. And then this time we need to do one step further. So after your method, do .onSetComplete, and we need to give it a method that's going to make the UI canvas inactive. So just create a new method below called UI hide, which will have a return type of void, and then pass that into your onSetComplete. Now that we have our interactable UI done, we can go and create a new script called cutscene start. And the first thing we're going to do is make this inherit at the top from our interactable generic script. So just replace monobehavior with interactable. The next step is to override the methods that we created in interactable. So simply do public override void activate, and then do the same for deactivate. Make sure you put inside the methods the base activate and the base deactivate. So what base activate and deactivate do is, since we've overridden the methods which are virtual from the interactable script, it simply calls their code first. So in this cutscene start script, we're now going to create another serialized field private variable, and this is going to be type of game object, and it will be called the cutscene to start. And this is going to be the cutscene we're going to activate and deactivate. Now what we're also going to do to help ourselves out is anywhere we drag this cutscene start script, we're going to make it automatically add some components. So above your class, do square bracket require component type of box collider. Then duplicate that line and make it require a component of signal receiver. Now that that is done, we're going to create a new game object in the workbench called cutscene starter. And then we're going to drag our cutscene starter script onto it, and you should see it's automatically added the box collider and the signal receiver. So make sure your box collider is of type trigger, otherwise it won't work with our onTrigger enter method. Then just center the box collider in front of the workbench to where you want it to be started from. Then the last thing is to drag your interactable UI into the canvas group property on the cutscene start. Now we can begin working our cutscene. So just create another new game object called workbench cutscene, and this will be where we house our timeline and everything to do with our cutscene. Next, in order to make our camera go from a smooth transition between our current camera to our cutscene, we're going to create a new camera called cutscene camera inside your character. Then copy the transform of your main camera and paste it on the cutscene camera. Perfect. Next, add a Cinemachine brain to the new cutscene camera, then go ahead and disable your main camera so we're only seeing the cutscene camera. Doing it this way means you can successfully move your cutscene camera around without interfering with your character's current vision. Perfect. So now we're ready to create our actual cutscene object using the timeline. So click on your Workbench cutscene game object and then go to Window, Sequencing, Timeline. So now that we have the timeline window open, making sure your Workbench cutscene game object is selected, you can click Create in the timeline. Once it's open, I'm just going to create a simple timelines folder and call it Workbench Cutscene. Cinemachine works by overriding cameras using different virtual cameras in different positions with different transitions in order to create your cutscenes or whatever you want. So we're going to go to the top Cinemachine and we're going to create a new virtual camera. I'm just going to rename this to Workbench Cutscene Camera and I'm going to drag it into the Workbench Cutscene game object. Next, simply position this camera to where you want it to start the cutscene, so I'm going to place it roughly where the player would activate the cutscene from. With the timeline object selected, in the left hand menu you can now right click and create a new Cinemachine track. In the object field that appears, click it and select your Cinemachine brain for the current cutscene you're working on, so the camera that's going to be controlled. Then in the right hand side you should be able to drag in all your virtual cameras you want to control for the cutscene. Now with the camera in the timeline object, you can move it left to right just by clicking and dragging. You can hold Ctrl/Command to zoom in to make it bigger or smaller as well. You can resize it by grabbing the end of it and dragging it bigger or smaller. If I just quickly as a demo add another virtual camera and drag it into the timeline object, you can see as they play, if I put them next to each other, the game will switch between those cameras, which is how you build up the different camera points. If you drag the cameras on top of each other, you see this little diagonal line appear. This is a transition effect and it will transition between the first camera to the second one. To get started on the cutscene, I'm going to create a new virtual camera and I'm going to call it Player Cutscene Camera. I'm going to make sure it's a parent of the player and then I'm going to copy the transform of the player's current camera and I'm going to paste this over the top of this camera. Then I'm going to drag this new virtual camera into our timeline object and position it in front of the current camera we just put there. And now as you can see, if we transition it over it, you can see it moves from our current player's facing direction to the current cutscene we want to view. Next on our cutscene we're going to add some sound. If you just right click on the left hand menu and choose audio track, we can now start putting sounds into our cutscene. And then I'm going to drag in my pre-recorded sound for this cutscene. So I'm going to go to our Workbench Cutscene parent game object and I'm going to quickly add an audio source and I'm just going to untick play on awake. And I'm going to drag this inside the object field in the timeline where it says no audio track. If you drag the camera out, you should be able to see and hear the cutscene taking place now. So I'm going to start activating bits that the cutscene requires. So the first thing I want to do is right click in the left hand menu and choose activation track. That way we can turn the light on and off. So I'm just going to position this in this little gap here and drag it down. But a note, you can't deactivate a track. You can only activate it. So if you want it to be deactivated, deactivate it and then just enable it where you want it, even if it's the majority of the cutscene. Now I'm going to grab the spotlight and I'm going to stick it in the object field on the activator. And as you can see, as I scroll on and off it, it should activate and deactivate it in time with the cutscene. Another quick thing I'm going to do is I'm going to actually turn the bulb itself on and off. So I'm going to simply create another activation track, drag the bulb in and resize it to the same portion of the light. And now, as you can see, they both turn on and off. So our timeline is getting very busy, so if you right click in the left hand menu and choose track group, you can rename it to anything you want. So I'm going to call mine Spotlight, and I'm just going to parent the two Spotlight activations into the track group. Now to make our cutscene seem a bit more lifelike, I'm going to add another audio track, and I'm going to drag our Workbench cutscene into the audio source. You can drag any audio source in you want, and I'm going to drag in a sound of a clicking to turn it on and off. You'll notice this time that I'm not using separate activation tracks for each sound. You can put as many sounds as you want on a track, just you'll have to layer them if you want them playing at the same time. So now, let's make the cutscene's main section take part. I'm going to create another activation object and I'm going to drag in our cutscene objects that we created earlier. And if I drag the activation track to where it belongs, you can see as we scroll over it, the items will appear and disappear, like we're working inside the cutscene. The next part of the We Happy Few cutscene is to create a fade to black camera, and this is actually really easy. So what we're going to do is create another Cinemachine virtual camera, and yes, you'll create a lot of these. Then I'm just going to copy the position of the current Workbench camera where we want it to fade from, and I'm going to paste it over the top of this camera as well so they're in the same position. And I'm just going to rename it to Fade to Black Camera. Once you've done that, simply go to the extensions at the bottom of this camera and choose Cinemachine Storyboard. I've imported this new texture sprite thing called black, and all it is a 1 by 1 pixel black dot. And I'm simply going to drag this into the show image texture on the storyboard. Then just simply change the aspect to stretch to fit so it fits the screen. And as you can see, we have a black camera. So just like before, in order to make this camera actually work for our cutscene, go back to Timeline Object, drag the virtual camera in and position it where you want to. For the fading effect, simply make sure you've dragged it on top of each other so the diagonal line goes down and it will fade in successfully. And you might be asking, how do we fade it back out? Simply drag the same camera you dragged in before, which is showing the scene, inside and put it after it, transitioning back out again. So getting into the gameplay aspect of this, first we're going to go to our cutscene start script that we had, and where we have the cutscene to play, simply drag your workbench cutscene game object inside this variable. Now, if you jump into your player controller script, we need to create 3 new variables. All 3 are going to be public game objects. The first one is going to be called first person camera. This will be the FPS version that the player controls with their keyboard and mouse. The next variable will be the cutscene camera. This is going to be the camera which houses brain. This camera needs to be enabled if you want to use Cinemachine, because Cinemachine requires a brain component camera. The final game object we're going to create is called cutscene player camera, which is going to be the camera which is from the player's point of view, so we can fade in from their current gameplay. Then just jump back into Unity and assign all 3 of these variables. Next, make sure you deactivate the cutscene game object, then disable your cutscene camera with the brain object and the player cutscene camera, and just make sure you enable the player's main camera where they can control the game. Jump into your cutscene start script, so inside the activate method underneath base.activate, you can type cutscene to play.setActive true and your cutscene will start. And then in order to make sure it's got the right camera set up, using our singleton, we can do playerController.instance.cutscene camera and set it active to true. Do the same thing for cutscene player camera, and then finally do the opposite for first person camera and set it to false. Copy these 4 lines of code into your deactivate method and we will reverse the boolean. So now what's only left is to actually deactivate the cutscene once it's finished. So we added a signal receiver in before to our workbench cutscene starter. So simply go to your timeline object at the left side, right click and choose signal track, drag in the cutscene starter object into it, and then on this line at the right side you should be able to right click and do add signal emitter. The signal system in Unity is a way for components to talk to each other, so we're going to emit a signal from the timeline object and we're going to listen for this signal in our cutscene script to know when to call deactivate. As you can see in the inspector, once your signal is selected and created, it will say there are no signal assets in your project. So simply click create signal, create a folder called signals just to keep it organised, and I'm going to call it cutscene deactivate. And as you can see now, it's asking for what to do with it. So if you drag your cutscene start game object inside the little object icon, you can access all the public variables on that game object. So I'm going to go into the cutscene start script and choose cutscene start deactivate. Now if you test it, you can see that you can successfully walk up to the cutscene, press your designated key to activate it, and then the cutscene will start playing and you will lose control. Okay, so I hope I've got everything I need. Let's get some light. And right, let's get to it. So, because we left the activation at the end, it will stay activated after the cutscene ends. And then right at the end, as you can see, the deactivation method is called and we regain full control. So we can move back out, move back in, and replay the cutscene again if you really want. Final thing we're going to do to our cutscene, just to add the cherry on the top, is we're going to add some cinematic black bars to the top and the bottom. So we're going to right click on our canvas and I'm going to create a new image. I'm going to set the colour to be black and I'm going to align it to stretch all the way across the top, like so. Then I'm going to duplicate it and I'm going to call it bottom cutscene bar, and I'm going to align it and stretch it to the bottom of the screen as well. So click on your top cutscene bar, then go to the animation window and click the create button. Then I'm going to create a folder called animation and I'm going to call this cutscene top bar in. Before we continue, something I forgot, let's just add a quick new game object inside the canvas called cutscene UI bars and parents 2 bars inside of this. This means we can activate and deactivate it so it's not taking up resources. So we're going to set the position of the top cutscene bar to 50 on the Y, and this will hide it out of view. Then I'm going to click the record button on the animator, and then at position 0 I'm going to set it to 50 again, overacting the same number, to automatically create a keyframe. Then at the 2-second mark I'm simply going to set it to -50 so it's in the screen, and if you play the animation you will see it move in and out. Now that we have our in animation, we need an out animation. So at this little button here next to the preview, click it and click create new clip. I'm going to call it cutscene top bar out, and I'm going to hit the record button. At position 0 I'm going to set it to -50 so it's visible, and then at position 2 seconds I'm going to set it to 50 so it's out of view. Then I'm just going to reverse this for the bottom, so I'm going to create a new animation called cutscene bar bottom in, cutscene bar bottom out, position them at -50 and 50 to show and hide them. Now that you have your 4 animations for in out on the top and bottom bars, we're going to go back to our timeline object, and I'm going to create a new track group called cutscene bars. Then inside here I'm going to create a new activation track, and I'm going to drag in our cutscene UI bars parent. Perfect. Now I'm going to stretch this activation to last the entire animation so we can activate and deactivate if we need to. Now I'm going to right click and create a new animation track and drag it inside the cutscene bars track group. Then I'm going to click on the little dot, and you can see we've only got 2 at the moment, so I'm going to assign top cutscene bar animator to this, and then from the project view I'm going to drag in the cutscene bar out to make the cutscene top bar come out. Perfect. And as you can see, these little loop icons, this means it's going to loop the animation over and over again, which we don't want. So what you can do is click on your animation in the project view and just untick this loop time for all the animations we've just created. Then we're going to drag our in animation to make sure the cutscene bar hides and stick it at the end. And there we go. And then we're going to duplicate all of this for the bottom bar. Then if you test the game, you will be able to see that the cutscene bars will successfully fade in at the start and then fade in at the end. So now that we have our cutscene, there are many different extensions you can build for it in order to make it fit your needs. One of the extensions I found that I wanted is to only allow the user to play the cutscene once and then, well, not activate it again. So if you go into your cutscene start method, at the top I'm going to create a new private serialized boolean called one time only. Then inside the deactivate method, I'm going to say if one time only. Then in order to stop the cutscene from playing, you've got 2 choices. You can deactivate it so you can play it again or use it later in the game, and that's as simple as going cutscene to play.setActive equals false, and this.gameObject.setActive equals false to deactivate the cutscene starter. The other option is to destroy the objects so they aren't taking up resources, which is what I'm going to do here. So I'm going to go destroy cutscene to play and destroy this.gameObject. Then back in the inspector you can see we've got a one time only tick box, so I'm going to tick it, and as we play the cutscene you can see it will now be destroyed so you cannot activate it again. So this is just a very small, simple cutscene, but using these little aspects you can build up so many parts for your cutscene to make anything you want. I've spent a few hours just creating this little cutscene here using a bunch of stuff I downloaded online, but it's nothing compared to what you can do. So let's just take a quick look.
So you're finally here then, eh? About damn time. Now, let's get down to business. The boss wants his money.
I don't have it.
Don't have it? Do you know what the boss is going to do to you? He'll put you in the ground.
I'm sick of him always asking for his money. I did the job, he said we were set. Now I'm going to have to deal with you as well.
No, don't do this. It'll only backfire for you. Just give the boss his money. Fine, bring it. Shoot me. I'll only need my hands to end you. Suck.
Oh, they've seen me. I've got to go. Thank you for watching my tutorial. It's been many years since I've last done one. If you enjoyed it, please hit the thumbs up and comment below what you'd like to see next.